Today I'm going to share with you how I create my bunny applique pillows. These are layered appliques and it's a technique that I came up with. And I'm going to show you three different styles. The first style, we're going to be working with burlap and some of my other favorite fabrics. This Osnaburg, it's by Rocklon, and it's a type of muslin fabric that has a very soft feel to it, and it's very similar to a homespun cotton. And I'm going to be using a faux sherpa with a suede backing. Burlap, this is burlap fabric that you would get in the fabric section. And this is felt, and it's by the yard. And I'm using the felt in a similar color to the burlap. It's like a camel color. And I'm going to share with you a few of these tips that I came up with or learned along the way about burlap. I want to make a mention as well, don't use your best scissors when you're cutting burlap because they do wear them down over time. I used a special pair just for that. And when you cut the burlap, to cut a straight line, you could make a little snip and grab the threading and pull it. And you can see there's a little bit of a channel here that you can use as a guide to cut a straight line. Because I've been cutting burlap for so long and so many times, I personally don't need to do that. You can see if you look between the weave and just follow along the weave. Here's a little bit farther away where you can see pulling the thread out. That gives you a better visual, especially if you're new to working with burlap. This can be very helpful. When I first worked with burlap, I used a rotary cutter and I just cut lines. I didn't know it would affect the end product, but it will, and your burlap can look kind of shifted in there. So this is how you cut the lines nice and straight. And we're going to start by cutting 11-inch squares. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to give an extra inch so we have a seam allowance when we sew the pillows together. And we're going to be using this felt fabric as the lining because burlap is a very loose weave, and when we stuff it at the end, we don't want the fibers coming through the fabric. Anytime I make pillows, I have my outer layer of fabric and then I have a liner on the inside. And I learned that if I did not use the liner, my pillow would look lumpy, or the fibers from the stuffing work its way through the pillow and they poke out everywhere. And it's very noticeable and it doesn't look polished. So it's best to use something as a liner. You can also use things like quilt batting and things like that. Now I like to use this muslin cotton fabric as the background of the applique because I like to do a layering style. You don't have to layer, you can just do the upper part of your applique and that's it. There doesn't need to be any other layers. This is my own special technique that I came up with. And the reason I like this is it gives it more texture and visual appeal, and it looks a little more distressed because you leave it with a little bit of a raw edge and it frays a little bit and it looks more farmhouse, and that's the look that I'm going for. Now, when I'm tracing out an applique, I switch between chalk, a pencil, and a pen, and I really like the Sharpie gel pens. They mark well on different fabrics. But depending on what you're marking on depends on what you want to mark with. Some people will only use chalk. I like this chalk pen because it has a very fine tip that you can even sharpen. However, though, in some instances, for me, it's just not quite enough. I need a really fine tip. And I think I use the pen here. Sometimes I'll use the pencil, but when you cut out after you trace, you don't want the ink or anything like that showing. So just cut inside the line. Now, my top tip is very sharp scissors. The first investments that you need to make when you're getting your sewing things together is the best pair of scissors. Get a good pair for cheap, and if you can invest in a nice pair that's going to last you for 20 years or more, do that. I would much rather have sharp scissors than even a sewing machine. Also, when I cut the layered part of the applique with the Osnaburg muslin, I just kept the two pieces layered together and cut them at the same time. After that, I'm going to cut out the top applique. And in this case, I'm showing you how I use faux Sherpa. The reason I like the suede back faux Sherpa is because it's very easy to draw out your design. When you're using the faux Sherpa with no backing, it's more like working with a knit. Anyways, you don't have to use such a thick fabric like this. You can use whatever fabrics that you want to. If you want to just use cotton, that's perfectly fine. When you're using something like a faux Sherpa, it's sort of like working with a faux fur. In fact, you'll probably find it in that section in your craft store. And I like the sharp scissors for this, and I just snip around with more or less the tip of the scissors to get a really fine trim. After I cut it out, I remove any loose hairs from the edge and then re-push it back into place with my hands to make it look more of a polished look. The next step is to sew the burlap squares together first. The reason we're sewing these squares together first before we add any applique is because we are working with burlap, and burlap is a very loosely woven fabric. It's made of jute, and the fibers unravel very easily, so you'll have strings hanging off the edge. In this case, I'm using a serger machine to give the finished look around the edge, which I really like, and if you have one, I highly recommend you use it. Another side note, for me, using a serger machine, I have all my threads in a color that's an eggshell color. The reason for this is because I mostly work with cream colored and light colored fabrics. I use it on white, I use it on tan. So I don't change out my threads every time I use my machine. There was a time for a few years where I didn't have my serger machine, and I just zigzagged around the edge. So you would do your regular straight stitch, and then you would go back and zigzag the edge. But you do want to create that edging so you're not having any unraveling, and your hard work doesn't get unraveled and your pillow would come apart. And you also want to make sure you always line the burlap. I like to line with the felt because it's very thick and heavy weighted, and it keeps it from looking lumpy. I have, however, used other materials like polyesters or cottons to line the burlap with, and it does have a different look, and it still looks nice. It gives a different appeal to the pillow in the end, as well as different styles of filling that you would stuff a pillow with would give a different look to your pillow. Now, after you've traced and cut out your applique, you want to center first the underneath layers on your pillow, and you want to make sure it's centered and it's not crooked, and just line it up the best you can. Then put your outer layer, in my case I'm using this faux Sherpa, on the top, and you pin them together, and make sure when you're pinning you go through all pieces and you don't want it to shift a lot. The next thing I want to mention is I'm using a heavyweight needle. If you do not, your needle will likely break, because in this case the fabrics are very thick. There's many layers and many thick fabrics. Now, you may not want to sew through this many layers or this thick of things on your machine. I don't want you to do anything that would jeopardize your machine or the timing or anything like that. This is just a demonstration to you of how I create my appliques and my personal techniques that I've came up with. And I've been doing this style for many years. My machine is 15, 20 years old at least, and still works great. So when you're sewing, you want to come in from the edge a 1/4 inch or so, maybe 3/8 of an inch. You don't want to get too close to the edge where you're coming off. And you just straight stitch around and you pivot at the corners. And when you go through the small areas, like a little foot here on the bunny, just get a little closer to the edge because you still want it to look like a foot and not just like one stitch through the middle. But be careful because this part I didn't pin. You can pin whatever you want that you feel comfortable with, but because there's smaller areas and it's thick fabrics, it can be hard to pin. So just go slowly and make sure your appliques are staying centered in that area. After you finish sewing around your applique, you want to take it back to your sewing table. And you can see here, I'm trimming off any areas that look uneven, where the under part of the applique is hanging over too much, because it's hard to get it perfectly centered. And sometimes when you trace and cut, it's not have to be exact. You will have a little shiftage in the fabric, and just give it a trim. If you do trim like that, just be very careful. You don't want to cut through the burlap or any of the other pieces. Just make sure your scissors are only trimming that part of the applique. Now you can leave it just as it is, but for me, my personal style, I like to adorn it, and I like to add a little pom-pom tail and a bow. Sometimes I'll add a tag or something else like that. You could put a saying in the corner of the pillow or on the bottom on a tag that you've created. And maybe I'll do some of those in another video. But in this case, we're just sewing on a tail and a jute twine bow. When you sew through a pom-pom tail, make sure you're going through the center. If you don't, it's not going to adhere well. And I like to use a thick, large needle, medium to large. I just don't like to use the real thin, small hand needles. Personally, I find it much easier to thread, and when I'm going through things like this, I want something sturdy and thick that's not going to bend or break. After you've embellished your pillow, if you so desire, you will then pin your squares together. When I pin together, I like to start at the corners and then work my way around through the sides typically first. So when I'm pinning, everything's lined up straight, because you don't want to pin it all and then have to unpin it and redo it. And when there's something like this example where there's a pom-pom tail in there, it kind of puckers on the fabric and you think, did I cut that square right? So you just want to pull the corners to where they meet first and make sure your edges are lined up. After you've pinned, you want to make sure you do leave an area for an opening. I'm showing a pin going like the wrong way to remind this is the opening, don't sew through. And you want to leave the opening large enough that you can fit your hand through. When you sew, again, we're using a heavy duty needle. Also, I don't think I mentioned earlier, when you're sewing through the applique or anything, you want to go through a slow setting on the applique. When you're going through and sewing your squares together, you can go through a medium setting or a little bit faster with your presser foot. And then for me, I like to sew this one around twice to make it extra secure because it's working with a burlap. After that, we're going to turn the pillow right side out. In the case of working with a burlap or any kind of thicker upholstery style fabrics, you have to work with it a bit. We're not putting a zipper in this or anything like that. This is just a basic pillow that we're stuffing. And you just have to work slowly. Once you get the pillow turned right side out, you'll take your tool. I like to use, this one's a bone folder, but they have ones that are specifically for sewing it that I'll link in the description, something similar. I highly recommend having that tool for any of your sewing projects. And turn your corners out and poke them out. And then you're going to stuff the pillow. This is a polyfill. It's a polyester fiberfill batting. I really like this filling. There's a few others I like. There's one you can get at Hobby Lobby. I think it's called Morning Glory or something. But this one's Polyfill brand, and it has a nice cushion to it. I find that it stays nice and firm and fluffy even after, if it's like a pillow on the couch where people sit on it after a while, it still holds pretty well for a long time. After you fully stuff your pillow, you want to make sure there's no lumps or gaps or anything. Check and make sure several times that there is batting in each corner and that it's very evenly, and squish it around really good. Then sew your pillow closed. And when I sew the pillow closed, I like to use a stitch that's hidden, and it just looks like a ladder. And I think it's called a blind stitch, or I can't remember. There's like several different names for this stitch. And you just go back and forth, and then you pull it closed. You can pull it halfway through and then do the other half, because you don't want to break your thread. And I'm still using a larger sized hand needle. That's my needle of choice when I'm sewing by hand. And that's basically it. After it's all sewn, you can then really set it on your table or in your hands and really work the fibers and squish it around and flatten, give it a bit more flattened, because you don't want it to look like a ball. You want to flatten the center a little bit so it's more of a pillow shape. And that's basically it. That's my techniques and my tips for the burlap. I also like to use a lint roller on it, especially if you're using it to sew. For this next pillow, we're doing the same size. All of these pillows are going to be 10-inch pillows, which we're cutting out 11-inch squares for a seam allowance. However, this one on the applique, we're going to use the adhesive, which this one is my absolute favorite by Heat and Bond, and it's the strongest one, and they do come in different weights. If you're working with lighter weight cottons and things like that, I recommend trying the less strength adhesive. But if you can, have them all on hand for your variety of your sewing arsenal if you like making appliques. Because I like making appliques with thick, heavy-duty fabrics like upholsteries and burlaps and such, I always tend to use this strong bond. Now, in this instance, I'm choosing this fabric that's sort of a faux fur, and it's like a stretch knit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adhere this to a piece of regular white cotton muslin. And the reason for that is I don't want it to have a stretch like a knit once I create the applique. So I'm making it more of a bonded fabric there. And I just used a pencil and cut out the shape of the bunny. And this is a separate template that I'm working with. And I'll leave the links to these bunnies if you want to find them in my Etsy shop where I have the patterns, as well as if I have the finished pillows, if I put in my other Etsy shop, I'll leave those links as well. And any of the links of the products I can think of for Amazon, I'll link as well for you. So in the same way that we did the first pillow, we're going to center the applique. The same where I have 2 layers of that bottom layer, where it's 2 layers of the cotton muslin, and then it's the upper layer of the furry bunny part. And I like the way that it gives that texture and dimension, but you very well could just do the furry bunny part. You can do this with any style of applique. It doesn't have to be a bunny. It can be anything. You can adorn all sorts of buttons or doodads as well on your appliques and make it your own. Once you sew your applique on the same way, heavy duty needle, slow stitch, the only difference is when you're working with layers of cottons and stuff, you can clip the corners of your pillows so long as you didn't use the serger machine around, and poke it with your corner, and that helps just reduce the bulk in the corners to give you a nice sharp point. And stuff with the same material and close it up the same way. On this final pillow, we're going to be working with a lot of beiges. This is also a cotton muslin, but this one is a different brand. I do get this one on Amazon, and I really like it for the stiffness, and it has a tighter weave. I can't remember the brand exactly, but it's something like Hodge Godin or something like that. And then this other fabric is an upholstery material, which I get a lot of fabrics like this at somewhere like Hobby Lobby. And you can even order those online. So I want to cut out the squares and repeat the same thing that I did on the other pillows. We're cutting out an 11-inch square. When I created the pattern, I did create a piece in there where you can make an 11-inch square from the paper. And if you don't like this style of using a cutting mat and a rotary cutter, you can just take a square on a piece of paper and use that to trace around and cut out squares. You just want to make sure that your fabrics are straight and you're not shifting your pattern. After you cut out your pillow squares, you're going to cut out your applique. I did use a different material for the liner. I used a cotton flannel that I have on hand because I have a lot of it and it's a little bit different of a texture. And I think I didn't have enough of the cotton muslin that I didn't want to use it. But you could use the same fabric that you did for the outer as you could for the liner. So just use whatever you have for the liner, just something that's not a dark color or a print that's going to show through your fabrics. I also wanted to show you in this example where I'm creating the pattern on some leftover cardboard cardstock from a box of cereal. And the reason I like to do this is if I use the pattern to make multiple pillows, it is much easier to trace around that cardboard than it is a piece of paper. But if you like, you can even just pin a piece of paper and cut your fabric out that way, however you like to do your applique. That's just an example of another technique that I do. After you cut your applique out and iron the piece together, because we bonded this one with the heat and bond as well, and you can iron it to the muslin. You can see it if you try to iron from the front, the upholstery fabric is too thick and you don't want to melt it because sometimes they have polyester in them and stuff. So I iron it from the back. And in the same fashion, you're going to adhere it to your 11-inch square with a heavy-duty needle, sewing on a slow setting. The other reason for sewing on a slow setting is if you don't, I find on my machine, I will skip stitches. It'll make my timing off where it doesn't want to sew through and the needle catch to the bobbin thread if I try to sew on like a medium or a fast speed. And even on the slow speed, you can see on the ears here, the thread looked a little off and I actually went through twice around the ears. Once you adhere them together, you do the same fashion. Snip the corners after you turn it right side out and poke them square, fill it, stuff it, sew it shut, and then squish it. Give it a good squish and get your good square shape. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this for spring.